I can see there's a lot of us online, which is great. I'm sure that there might be a couple of people still joining, but that is absolutely fine. They can join us as we go. So I'm Emma, from the General Manager of the Finnish-British Chamber of Commerce. So on behalf of myself, my colleagues at the Danish UK Association, the Norwegian British Chamber of Commerce, and Goodwille and Rochester PR, welcome to this webinar, Communications and COVID-19. What have we learned during business lockdown and what happens next? So before I let Joanna take the reins, I've just got a couple of sort of housekeeping issues. As participants, when you joined, all of your video and microphones are muted automatically. If you have any questions, if you have any issues with any technical issues, any sort of any issues with the broadcast, you can let us know through the Q&A function. Please use the Q&A function instead of the chat for all your questions as well. This webinar is recorded, and I will be managing your questions for the Q&A in the end. So just put your questions in the Q&A box for Joanna at the end. And now I will hand over to Joanna Dodd, who is the Managing Director of Rochester PR Group.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Hope it is well with you all. And just to reiterate really what Emma just said, thank you to all those people at the bottom, the Goodwille, Finnish-British Chamber, Danish UK and Norwegian British Chamber, for publicising this and for talking about it. So as you know, this webinar is all about communications and COVID. I think, in my opinion, just to kick off, communication has been key to how we've all felt about our jobs, our employers, our businesses, brands and lives in general. All of this is down to the communication of that. And some companies have definitely adapted better than others. We've all been on the receiving end, I think, of some annoying, perhaps sometimes astounding communication, whether that's by email or a Zoom Teams meeting. So the comms function, whether that's HR looking internally, marketing looking externally, their communication's been under more scrutiny than ever before. So we're going to pull together some of the things we've noticed and also think about advice for the next stage. First thing, I guess we were all hoping for some real clarity in terms of Sunday evening's briefing, but the unpicking is still going on. So apart from a potential for things getting back to normal, there hasn't been as much clarification as we'd wanted. So perhaps not as much as I can say about, oh, this has given us some real insight into the way it's going to go. But if anything, I think that's left more of a vacuum, which you as companies need to fill. You're going to need to reassure people more, tell them more about your plans, because at the moment they're certainly not getting the latest information from government. So in terms of what we're going to cover, a recap of where we find ourselves, and what we've learnt, how we can learn from crisis communications, which is what we do a lot of as PRs, both internally and externally, stakeholders, be that customers, clients, and how you communicate with them. A little bit about their channels, what's good, what the future might mean, and obviously some chance for questions at the end. So I just want to start with perhaps what I think is one of the most important things we've all had to learn recently, whether we know it or not, and that is how to adapt to changing situations and how important this is for the success of our businesses. What's reassuring, I guess, is that we're all in the same boat, because none of us have been here before. So I don't know how many of you remember this wonderful BBC interview with the guy with his family running in from the background whilst he's live online with the BBC. But actually, it's true. We're all doing jobs, unusual jobs sometimes at unusual hours, with our families, with different demands. Perhaps the day job has changed, which means along with teams not being in the same place, not all together, I think mistakes are more likely to happen and have happened. And communication is not as straightforward as it's previously been. So it's really tested the communication capability of some companies. especially those with dispersed workforces, which might be international companies. And it's exposed gaps and shortcomings in terms of chains of approval, the comments that were actually made, the speed of turnaround for getting those comments out there. And it's really continuing to be quite a challenge, constantly communicating from a geographic distance. But if anyone who's worked in crisis communications, a lot of that feels very normal when we're working under pressure. So we've all had to think a bit during COVID about a sort of a change of perspective. As I said, I think we've become much more aware of communications, whether that's the government's daily briefings, learning how to work better with colleagues when we're socially distanced, how we felt about companies that have been in touch with us by email, how we've responded to their ideas on social media. And we've become a lot more focused on what we feel about what people are doing and saying. And I think that's going to continue. I think it's a good time for you to make sure that your communication strategy and methods are appropriate and robust for your business going forward. But even if we think before COVID, I think social media, the web, they had all contributed to accelerate the pace at which events can move. It's made everyone more visible. And we also live in an ultra critical world. So things can move and change incredibly quickly, just like the virus COVID did. And things that seemed correct or right at the time that we said them can be proved wrong at a later date. And that's quite unnerving. So it's become easier to do or say the wrong thing without realizing it. And the thing I would say about in terms of crisis communications or a crisis, which we've all found ourselves in, companies are more highly scrutinized. They're judged and remembered for what they did or didn't do and for what they said or didn't say. But this new virtual, the new normal, which is coming towards us, is an opportunity for more brands and companies to look at comms anew, because we're all used to a much more virtual existence, and because of the lack of international and local travel, there's definitely less need to be seen on the ground. We've noticed this for our clients, where sort of not being able to attend a meeting in London is no longer an issue because none of us can. And I think, again, that's going to continue. So I think there's going to be new implications longer term for teams, how we work, and how international brands can work in the UK. So I'm going to suggest two things that you should sort now if you haven't already spent time looking at these areas. And the first is really to reassess your stakeholders, basically anyone that you need to communicate with. And I've put up here some very basic headings about what those might be. I think most companies will have known what their stakeholders were before COVID-19 and have been happily communicating. For others, I think it took them a little longer to get their act together. I think you could spot that quite early on. Where you were getting sort of what we are doing to protect our staff emails some weeks after you got the first flurry of what we're doing to protect our staff emails. And I think the longer that sort of goes on, the more that we feel about the people who are sending that communication that they're out of step with what's happening. And that's not a great thing to do. So some have been slow to get off the mark with their communications. I think the other thing that's happened, if you look at these different sectors here, is that actually people have found that they instinctively thought they knew how to get in touch with people and assumed that the databases were all held securely and it would be easy to just pick up the phone or send an email to such and such. But some companies have definitely found they've missed out on that, and it's causing them quite a lot of grief. So I would say now is a really good time to review this, check that you know who all your important stakeholders are. And the other thing I'd say is, I think for quite a few companies, your stakeholders will have changed or will change as we come out of lockdown. So again, lots of companies that I know or talk to or work with have changed and pivoted during COVID. So a business that might have been very B2B has moved to B2C or vice versa. And that will actually change some of these stakeholders and how important they are to you as a company and how much you need to communicate with them. So if you imagine this as a sort of an introductory map, what you would then do is fill in, if you like, all of the all the different areas within that, thinking about, you know, so under employees, it could be potential employees in the future, and things like that. It could be that your supplier base has changed. It could be that key opinion formers, new opinion formers have definitely come out during this period and emerged. The other thing that you really need to do is make sure you know about your messaging. So I think there's two things about that. One, again, we often find companies coming into the UK haven't perhaps nailed their messaging before they get here. And I think that's really important that you do. But also think again now about whether your messaging has changed recently and whether it's going to, change in the future. Those two slides are really about taking the time to assess what you need to communicate and to whom, because without really understanding that, you won't, I think, be successful. Some of the things that I think sort of rules in inverted commas that you should think about before coronavirus, we would always advise clients to be authentic in what they do. And I think that's a trend that started maybe with consumer brands, moved to business brands too. But authenticity has become hugely, hugely important during COVID. And I think, you know, the sort of the commonplace thing that brands that tell their stories in a genuine, open and transparent way will always be attractive is hugely important. And more so now for business brands as well, which perhaps hadn't been thought about. And also be consistent, although there's a slight difference, I think, about what we might mean about consistency in the new normal going forward. So consistency doesn't mean bashing away with the same message, but making sure that people understand you is hugely important. Don't let, in terms of consistency, one thing I would say is don't let current events drag you too far from your core purpose and mission. And I'll explain that a bit more as we go on, but that's definitely something that's shifted. So, although the slide came up a little early, I just wanted to give you some thoughts on why what has been happening during coronavirus is very similar to the way that PR works during a crisis situation for a client. So that's any situation that could affect a client's business. And some thoughts that I think are relevant to how we've all been working during COVID. Firstly, that it's all about reputation risk management. So even if COVID hasn't directly affected your business hugely, there is always that underlying, there could be a risk to your reputation if you don't communicate effectively. And as I say, the comms element is a very large component of a company's handling of the crisis, because it's the part that everyone can see. So in times of crisis, companies are more highly scrutinized, as I've said, and you need to be able to communicate authentically and with empathy and appropriately. And I think one of the things, if you haven't already noticed, I think it doesn't always come naturally to everybody. It doesn't come naturally to every CEO, for example. And one of the things that you need to think about is, you know, how you use your spokespeople going forward. Certainly in a crisis, there's usually a very small team of senior executives who understand sort of the dynamic of working in a crisis scenario and who can advise and plan calmly and communicate efficiently remotely. So hopefully, if you think back to the last 6-7 weeks or so in your companies, what you may have learned in terms of what's worked in terms of communications, and try and remember that for going forward. Some of the other similarities, I think, to crisis communications that we've seen recently is that crises, just by their very nature, happen at speed. There's definitely a lack of clarity, and there's certainly at the beginning an uncertain outcome. And I think for those of us now, this is exactly what we're still facing. It happened very quickly. COVID sort of happened. We didn't all have all our answers at the beginning, and we're still faced with quite an uncertain outcome. So it's really important to make sure that your communications is consistent with your overall company narrative and your messaging, you know, your tone of voice and how you describe yourselves, your mission, your vision, your corporate brand purpose. And again, I think if you stand back and think about some of the communication you might have been on the receiving end, I think it's quite easy to see where you think companies have mismatched what they normally, how they normally talk and what they normally say with the with the tone or their brand purpose. I think getting it wrong can damage your reputation. Not always, but it can, and it can certainly damage your credibility. So in times of crisis, the important thing is to do the right thing and be seen to be doing the right thing. And that's always quite crucial, as is doing it in a timely fashion, so that when you're in crisis mode, it's important for you to keep control of the narrative, not let everybody else fill the news vacuum. You should continue to be transparent and consistent across all platforms, and make sure you maintain that relevant and helpful flow of information. Because if you don't fill that vacuum about your business, then it's usually typically filled by speculation from the media saying, oh, well, they didn't give us comment, this is what we think is going on. So to a slightly lesser extent, we're all in that situation at the moment, and it's very important to keep communicating. So in terms of planning for the next stage, I just wanted to give you some ideas about why I think thinking like comms can be really useful to a business at this time. And I'll just sort of rattle off a few, and you can ask me at the end if you want more detail. But I think it is because comms people ask questions or suggest solutions that often people won't have thought of. Companies tend to be quite introspective. And comms people can do is help prevent that organization taking decisions in a vacuum, because we're always looking on the outside, particularly how those messages are going to land and play. What's the current thinking? What do we think, the media might be feeling? What do we think consumers might be receiving? What are the trends? What are other people doing? And so it helps to think like that. And it's not just about the message that you're putting out there. It is about, and then how do you think that's going to be received? And that's particularly important. It's about making sure that you get the desired outcomes that you're really wanting to get out there, whether that's providing better information or encouraging engagement. And thinking, as I say, what those different stakeholders, whether they're internal to your business or external to business, what are their expectations and what are they expecting to get out of you? Because I think under pressure, a lot of mistakes are made when things are done in haste. So, and they all have unintended consequences. So I think it's very important to get that very clear from the beginning in terms of how your thinking can help your business. What we've seen a lot recently, I think, is the marketing activity has really shifted from purpose to more than profit. So I think we're seeing that in a lot of the stories that we're all reading, maybe moving less from consumer marketing, more into community relations, what companies are doing to help local communities, which is a great opportunity, obviously, to win over hearts and minds and earn a place in people's lives that perhaps you didn't have that opportunity to do before. And I think also there has been a shift for companies looking to really work out the most cost efficient, timely sort of lo-fi as opposed to hi-fi production solutions. So, that's where things like social media has come into its own in terms of how that can get messages out there. And I think you only have to look around and you see all the wonderful advice that's there. This is just an example of GoDaddy and opening up. But there's been a lot of that in lots of different sectors. So there's definitely a shift to how people are sharing information. And, it's important for you to recognize how your company can play a part in that and not perhaps get left behind. And the final slide, I think, on comms thinking is perhaps things that you might have done during this period, during lockdown. And if you haven't done it, then it's really worth thinking about going forward. There will have been changes in, your external stakeholders, consumers, competitors, and, the changing market dynamics. You need to look at all of those and think, how does our company respond to that? How do we communicate? What's our positioning on that? What's our messaging on that? I think from the companies that we've seen that have done this well, there was a lot of work at the beginning looking at what internally they had in terms of people and other resources, what they could make work for them. They looked at quite a few, identifying, activating new opportunities. Again, as I said earlier, I think some were speedier than others, but a lot have reacted really well. And they're now looking at mapping different scenarios about what might move on in their market or sector or their industry. And that's about, you know, is there an opportunity to innovate with products and services? So the main thing I would say now is whatever comms you have been doing, whether you think it's been going really well or maybe not quite so well, now it's a really good time to build that tactical plan, sort of engage your team and think about how you're going to measure success going forward. I wanted to look at both internal and external, which is too huge to do any justice to in one webinar, but just really sort of to cover them off, because it's very important at this stage that you're being consistent with your messaging across both. But I think what we saw at the beginning was a lot of companies were quite worried about admitting that their business might have been affected at all. And I do remember seeing one company that I know announced very, very early on, even before the government had said anything about furloughing, just how badly they were going to be affected in terms of their staff. They got out incredibly quickly, which was a very bold move to make, and interesting that they decided to do it. But I think generally speaking, the decisions that businesses are having to make, I think most employees would recognize it's not a show of weakness, but you know, it is all about necessity and the future proofing of companies. So I think as long as you have been transparent and clear with your advice to your staff, and that has changed, you know, from the beginning where it might have been, you know, staying at home, and it's maybe moved into people who have contracted COVID, maybe it's now moved into furloughing, and now it's going to move on again into return to work. Just ensure that that advice that you're giving everybody is transparent and clear and appropriate. I think it's really important internally, obviously, to be sincere, not sort of standoffish. It's important to be timely, and timely, what is timely varies for every company. So that's a decision that everybody takes, whether it's, you know, a weekly meetup or however it's organised. And then, you know, considering the channels that you're using for internal communications, which may have shifted as well, with everybody working from home. So some systems that might have been working really well, perhaps everyone's actually just gradually migrated onto a different sort of way of keeping in touch. So make sure you're noticing that and keeping in touch. I think it has been really important to share plans with staff, get their input, and make sure they feel engaged with the challenges faced. And one of, including difficult trade-offs, one organisation that I know set up what they called the sustainability team very, very early on, pretty much the first week or so, to look at all sorts of areas about the future of this organisation, including things like, you know, a pay rise that was due to be announced, and they went back to the staff and said, you know, this is not going to happen. We will review it in whenever. But they also made it very clear that review didn't mean that there was going to be a pay rise. So they tried to be very clear with what they were saying. And they've carried on working on that with other steps taken. The senior team, for example, have taken salary sacrifice. Everything is being reported back to the internal team. And that's all about building a common sense of purpose, making sure that everybody's engaged. And actually, I think what's also been quite fun to watch is those new pockets of talent that everybody's discovered. I don't know, again, who saw the BBC weatherman play the drums, so play out his own weather forecast by running from outside his house back into his house to play the theme tune on the drums, or the Waitrose worker who was entertaining the crowds who were queuing to get into Waitrose. But there have been some great stories coming out from a team morale point of view. On the external comm side, the same as I said on internal, actually business decisions that are being made are not a show of weakness, but they are, you know, all about the long-term future. I think those, that were communicating with key stakeholders, I think that was hugely important. I think for many, actually, it should have been about upping the information flow. I know, with some of the people that I talk to, particularly I've got in mind one of, you know, maybe a supplier that we work with. I haven't heard anything from them at all, which I find very odd. And, you know, I think it does leave you feeling slightly differently about certain sort of pockets of your stakeholder groups than you did before, because the information flow is really there to make sure you're giving reassurance, if indeed you can, that your business will continue because, you know, the measures you're taking now. And I think there has been a real difference for some companies. For some, that's been relatively easy. It's about keeping in touch maybe with clients and customers, and it hasn't proved to be too huge a task. For others, I think it has been a lot more challenging, and, you know, they've had to sort of think harder about how they adapt their situation. But again, if you've done this in the right way, where you're spotting new opportunities that are to do with your external groups, helping them with their challenges, I think that's gone down incredibly well, and something that will continue. And again, I would say it's about being as transparent as you can at each stage, and thinking about how this could help lead to better relationships down the line. I think it's also really important on the external comms. I mentioned this a little earlier about messaging, to make sure that you're really sure of, you know, what your company is all about, and what it stands for. You know, you can afford in times like this to not to be quite so overly corporate in some of your communication. You want to still be seen to be very sincere about how these decisions are affecting you and your company, but don't lose sight of, you know, what your company is really all about. So if your company's biggest asset is your creativity, you can continue to be creative with your communications in the way that you do it, or what you include within it. I think people would find it odd if you change from, you know, being a very creative, loose-knit team with a very casual way of talking to suddenly coming over incredibly sort of, I don't know, not arrogant, but very buttoned up. People would find that strange. If your biggest asset is your people, you know, make sure, which I know a lot of us would say, make sure that they know that's still the case, you know, week by week. And then also think about, you know, how do you get these groups of people to work, because they need slightly new structures in order to get that creativity and teamwork working properly for external comms. I think stick to your values is hugely important. Stay true to everything that you believe in. And these are two examples that have been sort of quite widely reported that happened quite early on. So very briefly, I don't know how many of you will know them, but Waitrose actually came out quite early on and said that anybody or any of their workers forced to self-isolate due to a COVID infection in the family would have to make up their hours at a later date, which was not quite what John Lewis, their sister company, gone out with. And you know, they received quite a bit of criticism, and they immediately went back and said, we got it wrong, we've changed our policy, and, you know, we're moving on. So although they, you know, made a mistake, or, you know, you could argue they made a mistake with their initial response, they went back and clarified it and put it right. Hiscox, on the other hand, I think this is one that is still continuing now. They insure a lot of small companies, very small companies. They sell business interruption insurance. And there was a clause in there which was about, you know, if they couldn't get onto their premises due to restrictions by, you know, a public authority or human infectious or contagious disease. But actually what happened is they refused to pay out to anybody because of COVID and the government lockdown, because they actually said, well, that clause was more to do with, you know, an outbreak on the business premises. So again, I think there, what you might think about is, well, they had an opportunity, even if that is, you know, that is the case, that is their policy. They could have done something different. They could have come out and supported these small businesses, some of whom are really small, at a time, you know, when they really needed that help. It would have reinforced their Hiscox reputation. And I think at the time their shares fell quite hugely. So, you know, that's something that could, you can find with one thing like that can play out for a long time. On a different level, I just wanted to give you some examples of what our clients have been up to. You know, we've had one of our clients donated buildings for key worker accommodation. Another turned another building that was obviously empty into a mini factory where they started assembling visors and face masks, and also made it sort of part of the local community hub where they took donations from other people to manufacture. You know, a MarTech company who's using their chatbot technology to gather and supply information to the government on social distancing, an EdTech company that gave a big discount on its games during lockdown, but then also thought about, you know, the content that people might want. So started producing a lot of content on homeschooling and keeping kids entertained at home and things like that. There's obviously the webinars, this one, but others are doing lots of them. So from your point of view, I think as a company, what can you do? Can you identify an unfulfilled need, and can you innovate? All quite, you know, quite important to think about, and think about how that might change what you do. But I think in terms of, you know, what happens in a crisis might also be happening to companies at this stage, which is it is actually difficult to sustain this same sort of stress situation for a long period of time. But our advice is, you know, don't give up and don't get left behind. Even if you weren't quick to get off the mark at the beginning, there are still opportunities going forward to ensure that your communications is really spot on. So if you're thinking, you know, should we be reaching out at all? You know, we don't think we should. I'd say the default position would have to be yes, but obviously it does depend business by business, but I would say generally yes, think about communicating rather than not. But don't ignore the fact that the world has changed. You know, you can seem incredibly irrelevant, if not sometimes quite callous, if you ignore what's been going on around you and in your local community around the world. You know, it's all about having empathy rather than, you know, ambulance chasing. And, you know, you don't want to come out sort of saying we've sorted it, everything's fine and dandy, when we just don't know what's going to be happening. And the other thing I would say is be cautious about any sort of thinking or even surveys that you did before the pandemic. I think things have shifted enormously. I don't think we've seen the half of what's going to come out about businesses and how prepared they think. So it would be not that helpful to be going out communicating with messages that you had developed before COVID hit. But generally, keep communicating. I think your messaging that we talked about earlier is going to be even more vital when this is past. So do go back and think about that messaging. Put out the regular comms to your customers, employees, other stakeholders, you know, some that maybe you haven't had to communicate so far, you might now have to start thinking about communicating going forward. You know, don't ignore anybody. Take the opportunity to think about who you need to engage with, and, you know, provide those updates on how you are handling your business, any major changes that they should be aware of. It's all about reassuring them that your business is continuing, what you can do for them is continuing, whether that's, you know, consumers or other businesses, and try and maintain that honest and clear messaging and dialogue going forward. So it's about making sure that your content is going to be meaningful for whatever ends up being our new normal. And that's really what's worth concentrating on. This is some research taken from this is some data taken from a great piece of research by Havas called Meaningful Brands. If you haven't come across it before, it's really well worth a read. And this is definitely pre-COVID, but I tell you why I think that's quite interesting. I mean, that's in a world where we're sort of overloaded. We were already overloaded with content, and people then were saying they wouldn't care if, you know, 77% of the brands, you know, that they knew disappeared. And they reckoned, you know, that 58% of brand content was not meaningful then. It would be interesting to poll that now and see how people feel about companies and brands now, and what that communication feels like, and is it meaningful connections? And this is a quote from the CEO of Havas Group. You know, in this world, only brands that form meaningful connections with people prosper. It's no longer enough to produce products that work. You know, you as a brand, whether it's corporate brand or consumer brand, you need to know why people care about you and what makes your brand meaningful to them. So it's worth rethinking whether your content is still appropriate. The other thing that I would always say to people, but I think is also important now, is to keep your you know, your content as simple as you can whilst getting all the messages that you want to get across. You know, it's great sort of quote or idea here that if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think from our perspective as communications people, you know, if a client can't explain it to us, you know, you've got to think, how can we explain it to a journalist who has then got to reinterpret it for their readers or listeners, for example. So don't overcomplicate something. As I said earlier, we've all been in the same boat. So there's a lot of shared experience that means you perhaps don't need to go back and explain everything in quite so much detail. I also said I'd talk just a little bit about some of the different communications channels that you could have been using, will have been using, and some of the shifts maybe that might happen. So I'm going to sort of start with social media, which is obviously, as always, a great speedy way of sharing information. Enables you to reach and react with your audiences, which is good feedback, and hopefully you or your comms teams have been noticing what's been happening on that and feeding that back into a changing comms strategy. It's a relatively low cost way to make sure that, you know, people were kept in the loop and not left in the dark, and a great platform to showcase some of your great content, you know, with video, things like that, not you know, not going quiet in those times. Obviously a very good time for your content to be shared and to, you know, tap into what's going on. I know for one of our clients, you know, a consumer brand, we've done a lot more about cooking and baking during lockdown, which has been a big trend, and particularly with kids and how you engage with kids to get them involved in that. But I think some of the old rules of engagement have changed slightly. So things like the best time to post, most popular type of content, all of that has shifted a little bit. So I think there's an opportunity and a challenge, but an opportunity for you to relook at your content going forward. You know, is it going to be right? Is it going to match with what people are wanting? Another one, which I think we've all been on the receiving end of a lot, is emails. I can't count how many I got of these in the first few weeks, but a letter from our CEO. I think it's a really interesting thing how we felt about that, whether we perceived that as an intrusion or whether we were genuinely interested. I think there was a difference between that and then the more promotional mailers that dropped into our inboxes. I feel sure there should have been some automated sort of lead email generation that should have been turned off quite early on, and maybe the switch wasn't flicked. But, you know, in general, I suppose what we've been on the receiving end of is, you know, how they're handling this outbreak to ensure the safety of their staff and their clients' customers. There's going to be another wave of that. It hasn't quite happened yet, but there's going to be another wave of that in terms of how we're handling, you know, coming out of lockdown. But there is, I think, quite a danger that it's become a bit wallpapery. I know that a lot that I've got, I've sort of read the first paragraph and it sounded like the same one I got, you know, half an hour before from somebody else. So I think you need to think about that again in terms of your messaging, because how we perceive that email very much depends on how we felt about the brand before. And it's been an opportunity actually for some, you know, for some of us to engage more with new brands that we hadn't thought about, which is great. But I think, again, look at your stats. I don't know, you know, how many have you had a higher percentage of, you know, deletes or unopens or whatever's. I think it was a lot to do with the message of the subject line and the opening paragraph and whether those were good. A lot of them, as I said at the top, came from, you know, a message from our CEO or a letter from our CEO. On the media side, I think there's some interesting things that have happened and that will continue to happen. You know, there have been a lot of stats and predictions in the last few weeks. And there's some more research I just saw this morning about small businesses and how they're feeling. That's going to continue for quite some time. I think there's a real opportunity, as I said at the beginning, about stakeholders to think about really subdividing, those stakeholders into different groups, and could you really be very relevant, very pertinent for particular areas of your stakeholder group? Could it be advice that you could give to a certain sector that could be really useful to them? Journalists are obviously looking for good news stories all over the place. And I think there was at the beginning an interesting thing about when not all journalists were in their offices anymore. And so again, it almost comes back to that, the databases, the stakeholder groups I was telling you about at the beginning, about needing to get in touch with them and pitch them via Twitter, for example, which we did a lot of. Again, quite interesting if you are from a territory where you don't use Twitter in quite the same way, and I know a lot of our clients don't, but it is really useful here in the UK to engage with the media on Twitter, and we got a lot more engagement that way on certain products and services than we did through sort of traditional email or even telephone. So having those mobile numbers for key contacts was really important. And as I say, take a look at your stakeholder database and make sure that you've got it up to date. I think a good opportunity, though, that's come out of it is, with all these broadcast interviews being done remotely, the geographical location of international spokespeople is less of an issue. So I think that's a great opportunity for international brands. And it doesn't really matter that it's your spare room or it's your kitchen, people are still interested in talking to you. And then I think finally, I'd say going forward, as lockdown eases, as we come, there's going to be a lot more about prediction and what the future will hold type content. And I think it's going to be important, it's going to be in demand, but it's also going to be very important that you make yours different and more interesting than somebody else's. So in terms of what's coming next, I think, yes, the world is obviously very different, but it hasn't stopped turning. I do think messaging will be really, really crucial when this sort of starts to pass, in terms of, your business, your brands, and how that is talked about internally and externally. And I'd say, I think now is a good time to start planning and anticipating what that might be. Having that sort of comms thinking about, what if scenarios, what if our market moves this way? What if we've seen our competitor do that? What if we followed? What if we shifted in a different direction? And I think obviously it really depends what sort of business you are, but, just a couple of examples, what will, for business brands, what will the world of work look like? I was talking to a company the other day who gets most of their business through shows and exhibitions, and that's not going to happen. But how can you contribute, if everything moves online, can you contribute to that? And for B2C clients, I think it's really thinking about companies, thinking about what consumer habits will have changed and how you can still fulfill those, or do you need to adapt your offering? And then I just wanted to give you two examples really about, whilst for some companies, I think it might feel like business as usual, but in a strange environment, I think there are some shifts around us that are happening. I don't know if you saw, but Standard Life Aberdeen has pulled out of Davos for next year, just saying they think it's inappropriate to be there, given what's already been going on, which is interesting because it's a very forward-thinking sort of move. And they're really talking about how everything has moved very much more to local. And I think, again, that would be something when you're looking at stakeholders and messaging, is really thinking, what your business, whether it's B2B or B2C, needs to do for your local community. And then another one, which I think is interesting, is Marks and Spencer's, which has, really sort of come out with this, what they're calling this new program, which is called Never the Same Again, which again is a very bold statement about, it's not going to be the same. So we're all going to have to adapt to it. So I think whether we're thinking just of our own businesses and maybe things look okay at the moment, what's shifted around us is really important to know and understand, because you're going to be communicating in that environment, and you need to make sure that you're sitting within that in a natural setting. So, excuse me, that is the end of the presentation, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Joanna. That was really, really great and really interesting, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one online who thinks that. We've had a few questions come in through the Q&A. So I'm going to go through those, and then everybody else on the line, if you have any more questions, please write them in the Q&A, and we will see how many we have time to answer now. But to start off, we got quite early on, we got a question. Jenna, what do you mean when you say companies tend to be introspective? Can you give some examples of that, please?
Yeah, sure. So what I mean really is that when you're in a company, you tend to look at what you do, what you think, you know, what your processes are, your teams, everything like that. And you tend not at the beginning to think about how that might affect the external stakeholders. So what I really mean by that is comms people are quite good saying, yeah, no, that's great that we're doing that, or we're following that path, but actually, shouldn't we be thinking about this? Or did you just hear in the news this morning, this other company came out and say that? So rather than always looking in on what you're doing and, you know, what you're organizing and how you feel about it, it's really trying to map that against what's happening externally and taking a view of what everybody else is thinking around you. And that's what I really meant by that.
Okay. Thank you. And then the second question that came in was, how do I go about convincing people in our company to do more comms activity when times are tough?
Yeah, that also is tricky, because I think there is sometimes a natural reaction, which is to close down and to concentrate on what you need to be doing rather than thinking about how to communicate that. I think the only way I can really sort of prove that to a company is to show them quite how much is being done by other people and how they are missing out on a lot of opportunity to communicate, and that the ones that are getting attention and getting engagement and for example, appearing on the BBC as a spokesperson are the ones that are out there communicating and putting their stories and their opinions out there. So I think it's almost better to try and convince them by showing them quite how many opportunities there are out there at the moment and what other people are doing, unless, for one reason or another, some companies obviously decide they really don't want to communicate. But generally speaking, if you're, a company that needs consumers or customers, you will want to be keeping in touch with them and talking more to them, even when times are tough.
And then I think the next two questions that came in, I'll combine them because they're sort of related. So the first one was, how frequently should I communicate internally and externally? And can there be too much communication? And then the second one was, which one should I prioritize, internal or external communications?
Okay, right, I'll pick up on the second one. I think you have to prioritize them both, to be honest, at the moment. Internal communications has been hugely important. Again, if I go back to talking about crisis, you tend to think more about in a crisis scenario, you having to communicate externally. But I think for this, with the effect that it's had on businesses and therefore their teams, it's been hugely important to keep both internal and external communications working at the same sort of level. And then in terms of frequency, it is a really challenging one, because you don't want to over communicate and annoy people, because it can be intrusive. Particularly, employees can feel, hang on a second, I'm working from home now, this is my space, and having the company sort of imposing a lot of communication can actually feel quite odd to people. But I think internally, the best way that's handled is by asking people for feedback. We intend to do so. This is what companies did at the beginning. We intend to do this weekly, and we're also going to do X, on a Monday morning. Does that work? Can everybody join? Everybody happy to do that? that's easier in a way to get feedback from your internal teams. Externally, it's a little bit more tricky, because the way you tend to get feedback is through often negative feedback, which is to unsubscribe or to not answer. But I think I would say, generally speaking, I wouldn't expect to hear from companies that I buy from hugely regularly at all, because I'm not interested, but I might still be watching them on social. So even though I don't want another email telling me what they're still doing to protect their team and me from COVID, I've had one of those, thank you very much. I do still expect to see them communicating on social, because that's how I'm engaging with them. So I think it depends. You have to take a judgment call for each business. It's not going to be the same for frequency, but there can be too much. You're right, there can definitely be too much.
Yeah. We've still got a few more questions that have come in, and I think we've got about 5 minutes, so we're doing well on time. Have you seen any good examples of conference organizers creating virtual conferences, any sector?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you all the names, but it is something that we have been doing for certainly 2 or 3 of our clients, where we've been looking at conferences that were sort of due March, that all, I think the first thing that happened, they all got postponed till September. And we just thought, there's no way we can do all of these conferences in September. Suddenly, everything was shifting back into 1 month. I think that's going to shift again. I think some of those are not going to happen. And I think some of the conference organizers are beginning to be a lot more aware that they can't just put on what was a good conference or a good exhibition and put it on 6 months later. So those that I've seen that are doing it quite well are the ones which are what I would describe as slicing and dicing the content and running a series of more mini conferences, perhaps more targeted, so making it easier for companies to understand which bits to attend. And they're doing slightly different things. So there's for example webinars, but there's panel discussions going on for other people. I think quite a lot of them are being quite innovative, actually. I'd be surprised if they hadn't, if most of, I would say, the sectors that I've been looking at, which were sort of financial services, marketing, and tech, and women founders, a lot of the areas I've been looking at with my team, they're all doing some interesting things. So I would imagine a lot of the conference organizers are doing a lot of that.
Thank you. And then have you noticed a different approach to communication styles between UK-based and international organizations?
That's an interesting one. I suppose in terms of my own personal experience, I'm more on the receiving end of UK-based organizations, I guess. I think some of the differences that perhaps were there already, the different ways we use social media, the different ways we use content, and how what we like to engage with, that's probably been slightly exacerbated. I think we saw some companies, some international brands being slow to react. I think there was almost that belief at the beginning that if we carry on, things will be okay. I think nobody could quite understand what's happened. So I think it's probably less to do with whether they were UK based or international, more to do with how quickly they responded to what the change was likely to be around them, and whether they changed their communication style or content based on that. So probably not a international thing, but more of a preparedness, and their communications expertise or appetite has made the biggest difference. I can't hear Emma. You've gone.
Oh, sorry, I'm back now. Sorry, I was just saying that I think we can probably just whiz through the last 2 questions that we had. There was how can we make sure that our message to external stakeholders stays consistent across different internal departments?
Yes, I think that's a challenge that comes up during crisis comms a lot, which is making sure that, you know, the messages internally and externally are sort of similar. And as the question said, there, different internal departments might have a different view of what should be said. I think it has to be that you know, the core team that I was sort of explaining earlier is the one that does oversee you know, the messaging, not so much the individual bits of content, because if the messaging is clear, then obviously people can be empowered to go and create the different content. But I do think it has to be kept to a tight-knit team of people who understand what the company is trying to achieve, because it's often, like I say, you can misspeak. An internal department might not know that the plan is to do X in the future, and they might go out you know, with a message that then gets put out externally, which is actually not in keeping with what the company's core objective is, or consistent objective is. So I think you have to try and make sure that you pull a team together who are able to take a view on that, to make sure that and just make sure internally everybody knows that this is the way that comms is being handled at the moment, and this is what people need to do about it.
Yeah, and then final question that we had to come through was, I'm not sure my company has felt the need to change much in terms of its communications. Do you think this will be a challenge in the future? And if so, how big?
Yeah, as I say, I think there are some companies who haven't really felt the need, but I would just say, you know, I think if you stand back from your company, and as we were saying earlier, you know, don't be so introspective, but now stand back and have a look at what's happening outside, in the sort of wider market sector, in the community, in the UK. I think there is going to be a need to change, or at least to reassess. You may decide you don't need to change, but definitely think you need to reassess your communications and think about how that is going to affect people externally. And yes, I do think it's going to be a big challenge. I think there's still a lot of people working out, as I said at the beginning, almost what their messaging might be for the future. But it's going to be really important to try and get that done now, so as not to continue that sort of waiting game scenario for you know, longer than is necessary. Everybody wants, you know, their companies to get back as much as possible as they can onto a successful path, and I think communicating that is really a vital part of making sure that happens.
All right, great. Thank you so much for all the questions from all our participants. Thank you so much, Joanna, for all your answers and the presentation. That was really, really great. Thank you on behalf of the Finnish-British Chamber of Commerce, the Danish UK Association, and the Norwegian British Chamber of Commerce. Thank you also to Goodwille for hosting us today. Hope to see all of our participants back at our upcoming webinars. You can go check each individual chamber's websites for all of our upcoming webinars. We will also be sending you a thank you email afterwards with all information about upcoming things, and then we'll share also the recording of this webinar once it is ready. So thank you so much, everybody. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Goodwill, and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks for organising. Take care.